Hello, fellow faith processors. Welcome to this week's episode of Faith in Process, the show where we explore how real people are actively processing their faith in their writing, their work, and their everyday decisions. I'm your producer, Grayson Priest, and today Harry will be talking with Lonnie Yoder about the ways we can find the divine even in the midst of trauma. This episode is a bit heavier than some others, so I do have a couple of trigger warnings today. There is a brief mention of gun violence and of sexual abuse towards the end. Please listen at your own discretion. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to all of you faith processors in the room. We have two of them today, so we're super excited about that. And a welcome to all of you that are out there processing your faith, listening to this podcast. I am Harry Jarrett. I'm the pastor here at Pleasant Valley Church of the Brethren. And this is Faith in Process Sundays Cool. I think Sunday is cool. And so I'm trying to get everyone else to think that Sunday is cool and come and either join us in this Sunday school class at 9:30 at Pleasant Valley here in Weir's Cave, or to perhaps listen to this podcast. And very, very excited to have you back, Lonnie. Lonnie is a friend of mine, is a professor or emeritus. Are you professor emeritus?
I am.
Professor emeritus at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, where I got my Master's of Divinity. Lonnie taught me a lot of things, particularly about counseling and pastoral care and those kinds of things. But in addition, Lonnie taught me a lot about myself. Really was a support to me in a very difficult time. And, you know, I was thinking about it a little bit. I kind of want to say traumatic time because we're talking about trauma today and how we experience the divine or experience God in trauma, before trauma, after trauma. I know you've prepared some things. I kind of wanted to say that was a traumatic time, and maybe it was, but so much is happening in the world that's like really traumatic, right? And producing a lot of trauma in systems, in people, in families, you know, all those kinds of things. I hate to say what I experienced was traumatic, but it was not good, and it was not fun, but I did learn a lot of things through that, and I experienced the divine in a very real way through our conversations, through processing all of that, some of the things that you taught me through that process. So I'm just going to kind of give it over to you today as we talk about experiencing the divine in the midst of trauma.
Okay.
Go.
Thank you, Harry. Your question about what you experienced, whether it was trauma or not, is a great example of one of the things I want to say about trauma. The topic, the divine in the midst of trauma, two key words here: the divine and trauma. Both of which we have to kind of step back and look closely at in terms of what do we mean. I was thinking about that in terms of trauma, and that relates to your question about was what you experienced trauma or not, and we'll get to that. But I'm a part of a community of practice in the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. We have a Zoom session once a month.
What's a community of practice?
A community of practice is a group of individuals who come together in that organization to talk about, share case studies around the topic of interest. And our community of practice is around congregational consultation. In other words, working with one of the very things that we worked on that you were talking about.
Yeah,
you know,
broken pastors.
Yeah.
And broken pastoral situations.
Yep, and broken congregations and And I mentioned to the group at the end that I was going to do this podcast on the divine in the midst of trauma. And I said, do any of you have any words of wisdom for me as I go into this? And one of the individuals, his name's Barry, he's from Oregon, he said, make sure to highlight that the divine is experienced differently by different individuals. Well, that got me thinking about it. And so let me start with the divine or with God.
And even what we mean by the divine.
Yes, exactly. And three questions I kind of came up with. There would be more, but three questions. Who is God? In other words, what is the character of God? Where is God? This is the question of presence or absence.
Yeah.
Is God present or is God absent during a time of trauma, before, during, or after? And then finally, how does God relate to me or to us? And here, the classic example is God primarily experienced as a loving God or as a judging God. Now, that's a binary.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's on a continuum, but that binary is helpful in how God relates to us. And on that one, is God loving or judging? That can have a huge impact on how I or we experience trauma.
Yeah.
So that's the God side in terms of the complexity there. Trauma, when you suggested this as a topic for our consideration, the first thing that came to mind was a comment that Kenton Durstein made at one time, and I thought, what do you mean? He said, trauma is a growth industry right now. And what he meant by that was that many, many things are called trauma today that in the past would not have been called trauma.
Okay.
And I've come to say that the word trauma in some sense has been trivialized. I mean,
Well, it is kind of relative, a little bit.
Yeah.
Depending on what you compare it to.
Right.
You know.
Right. But here's an example. We use the word trauma pretty freely. I'm a huge sports fan. So if my favorite sports team loses a game at the end, just like...
Sure, it's traumatic.
It's traumatic. It's like I'm traumatized. That's not trauma.
Right. That's not the kind of trauma we're talking about.
Yeah. The kind of trauma we're talking about. I brought along a clinical definition. It's long. It's a little complicated, but I want to read it because I think it talks about a narrow clinical definition. Obviously, we can expand beyond it, but here it is.
Sure. And don't worry, because Grayson is going to speed this up. So it's just sort of like, and then we...
There we go.
Listeners can... No, don't do that, Grayson.
So trauma is a lasting emotional response. Hear that? A lasting emotional response to an event or a series of events that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So a lasting response to an event that overwhelms one's capacity to cope.
So it changes future behavior.
Yes.
And present behavior, yeah.
Causing severe distress and lasting negative effects on their mental, physical, or emotional well-being, okay? So that's the lasting effect. The event often involves threats to life, safety, or sanity, such as abuse, violence, disasters, or severe neglect, leading to impairments in functioning and symptoms like flashbacks, anxiety, or relationship issues.
Yeah.
So there's that long definition. But
so we're talking major things.
Yeah. Those clearly fit the category of trauma. The next thing I would say about trauma is and you use the term, it's relative. So we in this room could all experience the same event, and for 3 of us, it could be traumatic, and for 4 of us, it could not be traumatic.
Right.
So it's the response. The way I tend to think about trauma now is that there's a traumatic event or a crisis. Sometimes we use the word crisis. And then we have a response to that crisis. And for some of us, that response may be traumatic, triggering in some way. And if so, then we have to ask the question, how do we recover from this trauma? And then we get into what today is called trauma-informed care. I'm starting to see this in advertisements for positions like pastor. We want someone who is trauma-informed when it comes to care. Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The key there is, do we have the capacity to walk with someone who's experienced a traumatic event and may continue to deal with the effects of that traumatic event?
Sure.
And this gets to one more thing I want to say about trauma, and that is trauma can come from a single event. Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica recently is an example. This morning I woke up to the news of 2 gun violence situations, one at Brown University, one in Australia, I believe it was, where 11 people were killed, 11 Jewish people were killed.
Oh, wow.
At a Hanukkah event. Talk about trauma. If you're Jewish, you really need to deal with this dynamic given the Holocaust and even further back than that.
Sure.
But, so it can be a single event. It can be a kind of repeated event where over time, domestic violence is an example of this. Someone who's living in a domestic violence situation they're not experiencing the trauma continuously, but it comes and it goes.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I think you talked to me about, the difference between a cause and a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And, in listening to you about these similar events, for example, the shooting in Australia, that is a cause for trauma, but it also triggers historical trauma. And so then there's this huge wave of multiple traumas coming into that whole narrative and story and what that's doing for people. So since we have limited time, and of course this is a big conversation, and hopefully people will continue to think about that and chat about it, and we can perhaps continue it. But to move from, okay, we have an idea of what kind of trauma we're talking about, big stuff. Mm-hmm. So let's move to this whole experience of the divine. In that, before it, during, after, what are your thoughts on that? I just want to throw out a couple things that I thought about in preparation. Mm-hmm. One would be Ignatius and consolation and desolation, and that whole paradigm, of experiencing God both in consoling times and in desolate times, traumatic times, perhaps. I believe it was Brueggemann that talked about orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And then, just to throw in just a big wrench into the whole thing, we've got a guy named Jesus who was tortured on a cross, terrible, was flailed, was beaten, was bruised, was all of these kind of horrible, traumatic things, being killed on a cross, and then resurrected, and then as a human had experienced that, being divine, according to, our classical doctrine. So, having those three things before you, talk a little bit about the experience of the divine in the midst of trauma. Didn't expect that, did you?
No, I didn't. You're pushing me on my...
I know. I've been thinking about it.
So I have thoughts, though. I clearly have thoughts.
Good.
So when you talk about Jesus, okay, we're getting into what's called in theology Christology. What do we believe about Jesus?
About who is God? What is God? Right?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of in classic theology is God, or Jesus is both divine and human. So as you were talking about Jesus on the cross being tortured, my thought went immediately to something Jesus said on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Right.
That's not the divine Jesus talking. That's the human Jesus talking, if you will.
Okay.
So we often talk about Jesus being able to identify with whatever we experience in this life. And so to me, that's ironically kind of reassuring that he said that on the cross.
So it is common to experience the absence of God in the midst of trauma.
My own story during the pandemic, just quickly, I have a blood cancer that 37% of people with a blood cancer before vaccination in the pandemic died if they contracted COVID. Well, you can imagine what my experience was.
I remember talking to you in those days.
Yeah. So I was a mess. I say I was a hot mess.
You were a hot mess.
But anyway, my family and my friends said, you need to see a counselor. Well, I ended up seeing a life coach, and she, in the course of my time with her, which was virtual because it was during the pandemic, I have never met this person face to face ever, but she had a huge impact on my journey at that point. At one point, she invited me, she asked me what my greatest fear was. And I said, my greatest fear is that I'll be taken to the hospital, dropped off, and never see my family again. And I'll die. I'll die in the...
Yeah, because they weren't letting family into hospitals at that time.
So she invited me to, kind of exercise to go there. Go into that ICU room. You're dying. What are you experiencing? And you know what the first thing was that I said? God is there. In my whole struggle with this existential reality, I hadn't thought about God at all. Now, there's a confession for someone who's spent his entire life in this.
Yeah, telling people God is there.
So that made a huge difference. That I simply was able to recognize that no matter where I go, God is there. Even though I may experience absence.
Right.
The fact that I phenomenologically experience absence doesn't mean that God is not there.
Right.
I may not experience that presence, but
Yeah, I think it was Ignatius who was saying that you can't miss something that doesn't in first place exist or have been present. And so the very sensing of the absence of God means that God is resident in that situation. We just don't sense it at that point, which I found very helpful in times where I was like, where is God in all of this? It is reassurance. And I don't think that people think about that much. The sense of God being absent is a declaration of the presence of God in our experience.
and these experiences in the midst of trauma, you framed trauma in terms of before, during, and after. And I find that extremely helpful because it invites us to think about, rather than focus just on the trauma and what's happening in the moment, what precedes it and what follows it. And what precedes it, and I'll use the example I just shared, why was I able to affirm that God was in that ICU room? I think it was because of my long history of faith, of being with the people of God, with all these affirmations of the Christian faith. I was able to draw on that at a time when God felt absent.
Yeah, lived experience before.
Yeah. So I think in terms of how we draw on the before is to think about what are the spiritual practices and disciplines that we engage that are resource for us in the midst of trauma.
Which we do not, as a church, I don't think, talk nearly enough about.
Right.
Of course, the celebration of discipline, wonderful book that talks about, I can't remember how many.
Yeah, about a dozen.
Disciplines that we can practice that prepare us for crisis and trauma and for good things. Not only how to deal with difficult things, but also how to celebrate good things. And I think we really need to talk more about that as a church. We studied that book, I think, when we were in seminary.
I think it was in a formation class.
Yes, it was, and I was partially formed at that point. So
let's talk a little bit about, come back to this idea that the experience of trauma is dependent on our context and our experience. Early on in our year in Jamaica, and we were there 2001 and 2002. In fact, we were there when 9/11 happened. We had been in Jamaica about 2 weeks, and 9/11 happened. So we have a very different experience of 9/11.
I kind of remember that. 'Cause I was at the seminary when it happened.
Okay.
I mean, like literally in the building.
In the building.
Yes. And
Right.
we heard about this and we're watching. They moved a TV into the lobby of the seminary so we could, stay abreast on what was happening.
So about 2 weeks after 9/11, early on in Jamaica, there was a 13-year-old girl in our community. Her name was Mussy, Mussy, Mussy. Unusual name, but anyway. She was on kidney dialysis. And at that time in Jamaica, there were only 2 kidney dialysis machines in Kingston, which was a 2-hour drive away. And one of those kidney dialysis machines stopped working. And she missed several of her appointments, and she died.
Oh, no.
As a result. So your response is my response, was our response. Oh, no. This is a tragedy, right? This is a tragedy. A 13-year-old girl not having access to the medical care that she needs, and she dies.
Yeah.
What really struck us was that her family and the community did not focus on that at all. They simply named the reality that Mussy had died because she didn't have the medical care she needed. But there was no belaboring the point, so to speak. It was like...
Was because that kind of thing just was so common, or they had a faith behind that, or what?
Both. One of the things we learned in our time there was that because of the challenges in the life of a typical Jamaican, particularly in rural areas where we lived, this was just in some ways par for the course. Now, maybe an exaggerated example of par for the course, but it was this happens.
Oh, wow.
Life happens.
Well, yeah, and that's probably more common in the world than our lived experience.
Exactly. And I remember it because, and this goes to the after a trauma, what are the ways that we can work with the trauma? And ritual is the word that comes to mind.
Yeah.
To ritualize it in some way. So We had developed a friendship with a woman in the community, kind of a matriarch, and she came to us and she said, and I remember this because it was so challenging given the technology, she said, could you make a bookmark that has Musi's name on it that we could hand out?
Yeah, to kind of memorialize.
Yeah, to memorialize. So we worked at that. We struggled. We actually struggled because the technology was not there. We did have a computer, but still, it was very challenging. And then what do? How do you print these bookmarks once you were eventually able to do that? But I remember that incident as an example of a way to respond to a trauma. They wanted to remember
her life.
Her life. Wanted to remember Musa,
Right.
to have something tangible to remember her. There was absolutely no focus on the tragedy. None. I heard no one say, isn't that
And what was
awful?"
the faith narrative?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
Yeah.
Because you said you thought there might have been one.
Yeah.
Be interesting.
Yeah, there is a strong religious current in Jamaican
Sure.
society and culture.
Yeah. We're about at that time where we open it up for questions.
Okay.
And we do
I'd
have
love to hear
some folks
from
in the
these
room
folks here.
to ask questions. So do y'all have any questions about this for us, Lonnie, me?
So you talked early on about how a certain experience can be traumatic for one person but not traumatic for another person. What are ways that we can, well, let's say practice our faith in ways that will help us be more, I guess, able to work through those things sort of in advance so that, I don't know, that's not the right way to say it necessarily, but yeah, to make more resilience or to be more resilient in those circumstances.
To make it through better.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the spiritual practices. The very thing that we're doing today, this morning, Christians gather weekly for worship. That is a spiritual practice. That is a spiritual practice. It made the pandemic a really interesting case study in trauma because in person that was taken away like in a week. It was gone. In person, we had the virtual, we adapted.
Which in itself was traumatic.
Yeah, figuring that out, we all, I think, discovered what we missed about being in person with one another. For me, it was a lot of it was visual.
We all, I think, discovered
seeing children
what we
playing
missed
in the
about
pews,
being
watching how different people were responding to what was happening in worship.
visual.
I discovered that was really important, and while you could have a bit of that in the virtual setting, we're often focused on the preacher or the person leading the songs or that. So I think to your question, spiritual practices, some of which we're not really very intentional about. We just, they're part
Can
of
you
our.
name some of those? Do you think might be particularly helpful in regards to caring for? I mean, what we're talking about is trauma is going to come, probably. At the very least, bad things in crisis. How do we spiritually, emotionally, sexually prepare ourselves through some sort of engagement with the divine for it?
Two classic that, again, we just kind of almost take for granted, but are important. Reading Scripture. So Scripture becomes a resource to us in these times. Psalm 139, I thought Psalm 139, a long psalm, but there's much in there that talks about who God is, how we relate to God. So reading Scripture, prayer practices. So in my crisis at the beginning of the pandemic, thinking if I contract COVID, there's a 1 in 3 chance of dying. I didn't like those odds at all.
Not great.
What was my prayer life like? Well, it was actually in some ways diminished, but it was reduced in an interesting way. I found that the only thing I could pray about was my feelings.
At the beginning of
That was it. It was like my world just got really narrowed down. And I developed a practice, a prayer practice that I engage to this day. And I don't know how I came up with this. I named members of my family, so I would say, Teresa, may she experience divine presence, divine protection, and divine peace. Notice all of those are P's.
So alliteration.
You're right. So I would name every member of my family and say, may they experience divine presence, divine protection, divine peace.
But it was reduced.
And that I'm intuiting a little bit that prayer, in fact, came back on you as well. As you prayed those things.
I was the last one. I pray for divine presence, protection and peace for myself.
Yeah, but I think what I'm suggesting is that in praying those things for others, I bet that you had a cumulative building of those things in your life as well as you entrusted those things, those people to God. I want to come back to the reading of Scripture because some would say, and I might be one of those people, that Jesus' statement on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is actually the beginning of the story.
Right. So I would
That goes on to talk
remember my
about
family
how God is present in the midst of trauma. And that I was taught by somebody, perhaps even in seminary, that a rabbinic tradition was to, when you didn't have time to recite the entire scripture or the entire
I
psalm,
was the last one.
you just said the first line.
Interesting.
And that reminded everybody, and most importantly the person, of everything that followed.
Yeah.
You never heard that?
No.
No. That is.
There's always something.
I said it, so it must be true.
I want to say one more thing. This ritual,
Which is what you're talking about, is putting that scripture to heart. And then that can become a resource for us in the midst of trauma, and thus we experience.
Because some would say, and I might be one of those
So
people,
this morning, this Jewish community that experienced the death of 11 of their members by gun violence in Australia, the news report said there was a Jewish rabbi who was performing a wedding nearby. And this Jewish rabbi was then interviewed, and I saw a clip from the interview, and the person doing the interview asked him, so what are you going to do? His response was very simple. He said, we will continue to light our candles, which is ritual, Jewish ritual. He said, we will continue to light our candles. Powerful. And it just struck me that, okay, here is a long tradition in the Jewish world, this idea of lighting candles.
And dealing with trauma.
Yeah. And it's true in our Christian tradition. This time of the year, Advent, Christmas, we light candles.
Lighting the third candle of
Right?
Advent.
Right? So yeah, in terms of responding, well, before, you were asking before, but even after, again, drawing on resources and doing that creatively.
Yeah. Seems like I'm going to have to do a class on spiritual discipline. Yes, ma'am.
I would love to hear you talk about how we can best help people dealing with trauma during and after that do not come from a spiritual or religious
Good faith.
background.
Yeah, good question.
It's a great question. My immediate response is to be present with them. Presence is so important. So I taught pastoral care and counseling for 3 decades, and I used to start with teaching skills to start with listening. We need to listen well. And I discovered, I missed the prior thing, and that's just to show up, to be there. Now, we can get into a whole other topic about how are we there. It's like, am I rushing in with the answer, with the solution, with so Harry's experiencing something very painful, I can rush in and try to fix him.
Or tell your story.
Yeah. Or,
I hate that. You're talking to somebody and you're telling them all the bad stuff that's happening in your life, and then all of a sudden, I remember the time that I was, and I'm like, wait a minute, I really needed this to be about me.
So I think to be present with those individuals and to try to understand and care for what their journey looks like. What is this traumatic event? What does it mean for them? How has it affected their life? Often day to day. We haven't even talked about, I think, probably one of the most complex traumas, and that's childhood sexual abuse. That's a whole nother topic, but I have discovered in walking with individuals who've experienced childhood sexual abuse that I have a lot to learn. I have an incredible amount to learn in terms of what that experience is about and how impactful that experience is, not just at the time, but throughout life.
Oh, yeah.
Throughout life.
It's not just something that just gets fixed and goes away and you're all better.
Yeah.
Well, and I think hearing what you're talking about here, as far as coming in and being present in those situations and listening, I think, too, it's really somehow we do, I don't want to say deal with our trauma, but we do need to address our own personal trauma and somehow find healing. You know, your definition says you lose capacity to cope, and it really defines your behavior. A lot of times I think we tend to just try to ignore our trauma and just push it to the side and just get better. And people, of course, really want us to just get better and not really talk about our trauma and our grieving and all of those kinds of things. But what happens is, and I learned this partly from our conversations and partly just from your teaching, is that as pastors, and I would say people too, when we're talking to other people, we need to be very aware, and we need to be at a place where we have dealt with our own trauma and our own pain and our own needs for healing and needs for affirmation or whatever it might be personally, or else when we start talking or entering into other people's trauma, we're going to actually create more trauma because we're bringing unresolved stuff from ourselves into that conversation, into that situation, and we're just making it worse, not better. And I think that's really important. I don't know if you have any last-minute thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's kind of re-traumatizing.
Yeah, everybody.
And before we went on air here, you discovered that I had gone to Haiti after the earthquake there.
You went on a trauma team, right?
Yeah, it was a trauma team, and we worked with pastors and teachers processing the impact of that earthquake, and that's a whole other story. But one part of that experience was we were there, and a trauma expert came, and she challenged our team, saying, you shouldn't be here. You're just re-traumatizing these people by inviting them to talk about and process what they experienced. It was a good challenge. I didn't agree with her because I think there is a way to be present with someone and invite someone, if they choose to talk about their trauma.
Right. As long as you're doing it for the right reasons, I think.
This reminds me of one more story, a Jamaican story. I said Jamaica has just been incredibly influential in my understanding of trauma. I remember a woman who was actually a co-pastor with her husband came to me with a drawing, and she had on the drawing, I forget how many different houses, very simple stick houses that she said, this is how many houses I lived in as a child. And she was trying to tell me that she'd experienced a lot of trauma in her family growing up. And she went on to say, in our Jamaican families, there's tremendous hurt and pain, and how do we deal with this? Well, through my kind of North American U.S. lens, I said, you need to talk about it. You need to process it. She said, just immediately, that won't work. That won't work. So I was smart enough to not challenge her. I said, okay, so help me understand what could be helpful? Mm-hmm. What could be helpful to process? She had an answer immediately, music. If you know Jamaican, music is central to their culture, and it was like another lesson for me about what I think is going to help you may not help.
May not be good.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
We could talk forever.
Very sensitive about that.
It might help a little bit, but music may have a powerful impact in a way that all the words that we have back and forth may not.
Right. Well, Lonnie, thank you.
Sure.
Very much. Only the tip of the iceberg, I'm thinking.
Further we go, the more there is to talk about.
I know. So we'll have you back, hopefully, again, if you keep coming back. Thank you all very much. I wish there was more time to have you ask questions or whatnot. And thank you all for listening to this on the podcast. Y'all have a great day, and we'll see you in church. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Faith in Process. Make sure you're the first to know when a new episode comes out by following us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you stayed this long, you might as well share this episode with one of your friends so you can continue the conversation. This Sunday, Lonnie Yoder returned to talk to Pastor Harry about how we can find the divine even in the midst of trauma. We will be taking 1 week off for producing this podcast over the holidays, so we will not be releasing an episode on December 28th. You're invited to join us in person on the 28th to hear Harry talk with pastor and annual conference moderator Don Fitzke about how the church grows and changes, specifically addressing the question, how do we know which changes actually make us more like Christ? There will not be an episode of the podcast released on December 28th, but you can listen to Harry and Don's conversation in the new year on January 4th. To find our schedule of upcoming speakers, go online to pleasantvalleyalive.org and navigate to Groups in the top menu, then select Adult Ministries and choose Faith in Process. You could do all of that, or you could just follow the link in this episode's description. If you are a young adult looking for a faith community in the Shenandoah Valley, come join us at 9:30 this Sunday at Pleasant Valley Church of the Brethren to be a part of the conversation. Worship follows Sunday school at 10:30. This group is intended for adults from age 19 to 35, but if you fall outside of that age range, thank you for listening. You're still welcome to join us in person, or if you'd like, you can come join one of our other Sunday school groups. You can find more information about those at pleasantvalleyalive.org. Thanks again for listening.